I still remember that night. The screams, the blood, the darkness, it's a horror that has stayed with me all these years. The town of Gibeah was never the same after what happened to the Levite's concubine, but few speak of what led to her grisly fate. Few want to admit how her unfaithfulness set in motion a chain of events that would destroy not just her, but an entire tribe of Israel. She was young, this concubine, barely a woman. Her name is lost to time, but her story, it lives on in shadows, whispered among the elders as a cautionary tale. She belonged to a Levite, a man of status and duty, who had taken her as a concubine to serve him, a common practice in those days. But instead of loyalty, she betrayed him. Her heart wandered, as did her body. The concubine left him. She ran to her father's house in Bethlehem, seeking refuge after her betrayal. The Levite, angry and dishonored, waited 4 months before going after her. When he finally set out to retrieve her, he didn't do so out of love. It was pride, wounded pride, that led him to the doorstep of her father's house. He couldn't let his concubine, his possession, escape him like that. In a society where a woman's fidelity was her worth, her unfaithfulness had already sealed her fate. But I was there, too, when he found her. The reunion was awkward. Her father tried to appease the Levite, offering him food and drink, keeping him there for days. Perhaps the father knew what awaited his daughter, the wrath of a man who had been shamed. Or perhaps he thought the Levite's anger had cooled. He was wrong. When the Levite finally took his concubine and began the journey home, night fell upon us near Gibeah, a town of the tribe of Benjamin. We sought shelter there, hoping to rest, but the town was inhospitable, cold. No one offered a place to stay, no one except for an old man who took pity on us. He opened his home, offering safety for the night. Or so we thought. But Gibeah was not a place of safety. The men of the town, wicked, corrupt, soon gathered outside the old man's home, demanding something vile. It was like the stories of Sodom, the very wickedness that God had once destroyed. They wanted the Levite to abuse him, to degrade him. But what happened next? It was something darker. I watched, paralyzed, as the Levite pushed his concubine out the door. He threw her to the wolves, sacrificing her to save himself. She was the offering, the scapegoat for his pride and fear. She was the one who had been unfaithful, after all. Maybe in his mind, this was justice for her betrayal. But what unfolded was beyond justice, it was a nightmare. They descended upon her, these men of Gibeah, and what they did to her over the course of that night. I cannot describe it in words. The brutality, the inhumanity, it was as if the very heart of sin had overtaken them. She screamed, but no one answered. Not the Levite. Not the old man. No one came to her aid as the men took turns, breaking her body, crushing her spirit. By morning, she was barely alive. She crawled back to the door where her master, the Levite, lay inside. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the threshold, as if hoping for some final shred of mercy. But it was too late. When the Levite found her at dawn, her body was lifeless, broken beyond repair. I watched as he coldly lifted her corpse onto his donkey, showing no grief, no sorrow. There was only calculation in his eyes. The unfaithful concubine had met her end, but he was far from finished. Her death was not enough for him. He wanted vengeance, not for her, but for the dishonor he had suffered. And so, in an act that chills me to this day, he took her body, dismembered it into 12 pieces, and sent them across the tribes of Israel. 12 bloody tokens, each limb a message, look at what has been done. This is the outrage that has been committed. But in truth, it wasn't just the men of Gibeah who were guilty. The Levite, too, had a hand in her death. He had pushed her into the arms of those monsters. What followed was a war, a bloody, brutal war. The tribes of Israel united against Benjamin, demanding justice for the concubine. They slaughtered the Benjaminites, nearly wiping out an entire tribe. Thousands of men, women, and children perished because of what happened that night in Gibeah. And the concubine. She became a symbol, not of innocence, but of the chaos that ensues when sin is allowed to fester unchecked. Her unfaithfulness had started the tragedy, but it was the actions of the Levite and the wicked men of Gibeah that turned it into a nightmare. In the end, she was a victim, yes. But she was also the spark that ignited a war that devastated Israel and nearly destroyed one of its tribes. Her betrayal of the Levite set the stage for her own horrific death and the bloodshed that followed. She was more than just a concubine. She was a catalyst for judgment. Now, when the elders speak of Gibeah, they do so with hushed voices, remembering the night when sin consumed an entire town and nearly an entire tribe. They remember the unfaithful concubine who, in death, became a lesson of what happens when betrayal, pride, and violence are left to rage unchecked. It was not just her body that was broken, it was the soul of a nation. The Levite's concubine, though she didn't wield power or influence like some of the more notorious women in the Bible, is a bad girl in that her infidelity and the moral collapse surrounding her death became the spark that ignited a national catastrophe. Her story is a grim reminder of how personal betrayal can spiral into widespread devastation. You've just uncovered one of the most pivotal stories in our Bad Girls of the Bible series, where we dive deep into the choices that shaped history. Don't let the lesson stop here. Like this video if it gave you a fresh perspective, share it with others who need to hear these powerful truths, and subscribe to follow the rest of the series. Each story will challenge you, inspire you, and strengthen your walk with God. Join us on this journey of faith, where every decision counts.